further ado, I will hand over to Matt Walker, Chair of the IIS Policy Development Committee, to introduce the webinar. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aurelian, and hi, everyone. I'm Matt Walker. I manage the Federal Reserve's supervision and regulation of insurance companies. But as Aurelian said, I'm here speaking today to you in my capacity as chair of the IIS's Policy Development Committee. I want to start by welcoming everyone here today and actually sincerely thanking you for all your engagement over the last decade. As will be a theme on this webinar, I suspect that this has been a very long process for the IIS, and we on the team are excited to be getting close to the finish line here. We have a couple of pieces of exciting news to share today. One goal of the call today is just to walk you through what's new this year. Following your engagement, including through the consultation comments from last year, the data from volunteer groups and stakeholder workshops, as well as webinars like this, we've taken this feedback into account, and we're going to be able to update you on what changes we're making in response to that this year. We're also excited that as we do approach the finish line on the ICS, increasingly our attention, at least at the committee level, is turning from technical stuff on the ICS to looking ahead to what's next in the project, particularly implementation. So that was a focus of our discussions last week in Basel, and we have some updates on that for you today later in the call. One thing we won't be covering today is the aggregation method. I know this is an important project that's important to many of you. We're going to be covering that later in the global seminar in July. If you turn to slide 5, we can go through our agenda pretty quickly so you know what to expect. I've already covered a lot of this. I'm going to start by giving you a very brief introduction to the ICS just as a refresher. Then we're going to walk through the changes for this year. Paulo is going to go through the consultation from last year. Then Lazar is going to cover the economic impact assessment, followed by Aurelian, Martin, and Gilbert walking through some of the key changes for this year. Paulo is then going to come back and give an update on the ICS calibration document. Some of your feedback over the years has been that you wanted more information about how some of the ICS risk charges are calibrated. We're excited that a document explaining more about that is working its way through the IAS approval process, and we'll have a document on that later this year. Martin is then going to give an update on ICP 14 covering valuation, as well as ICP 17 covering capital adequacy. You may recall that we released these for consultation, versions of these for consultation last year alongside the candidate ICS as a PCR. Martin's going to give an update on the feedback we received. Aurelian's then going to walk through the schedule for the rest of the 2024 before Ramon takes us and looks further ahead on some of the updates on what we are thinking for ICS implementation. And I'm going to try to save as much time as we can for your questions at the end. I know I appreciate the interaction. I've heard from all of you, you do as well. So with that, I'm going to go very quickly through the ICS background. Frankly, if you're new to the ICS, this is probably not the place to be starting, but I will give you a quick refresher. The ICS is the quantitative component of ComFrame, the common framework for the supervision of internationally active insurance groups. It is meant to be an enterprise-wide capital requirement. It's meant to be a minimum standard. And as the name suggests, the focus is really on insurance. 3 components to the ICS. We cover valuation, capital resources, and capital requirements, which are meant to cover all material risks for the insurance group. The next slide gives an overview of our process to date. As I've mentioned, we've had a long process to date. You'll notice it's the timeline starts there more than a decade ago. Our first 6 years there were spent in field testing and developing the ICS. We had quantitative field tests in each of those years, as well as 3 consultations. In 2020, we started a 5-year monitoring period. That was the first phase of implementation of the ICS. Each year we released technical specifications, and informed by the feedback from volunteer groups as part of their submissions, through workshops, and most recently through our consultation, we update these technical specifications each year. The latest was the 4th consultation last year, and with that, I will turn over to Paulo to walk through from 2023 to 2024 and that public consultation. Paulo.
Thank you very much, Matt. And for those who don't know me, I'm Paolo Cadoni. I work for the Bank of England, but also the chair of the Capital, Solvency and Field Testing Working Group, the group which has been inflicting pain to all of you over the last decade. Okay, just let me give you a bit of recap on where we are. Okay, last year in March, the IIS approved the candidate ICS for as a prescribed capital requirement, which is the version which has been used for the 2023 consultation on the design of the ICS, but also the starting point for the economic impact assessment and for the 2023 data collection last year. Now, in light of that, we consider the input we received last year through the public consultation and also the feedback which was coming from the economic impact assessment, including the results we received from the last year data collection. And what we did, we made some additional adjustment, which we reflected in the technical specification for the 2024 data collection, which has been released today. You'll find it today in the IIS website. Next slide, please. In terms of the consultation in itself, the consultation concluded 78 questions, which span along 22 teams, and most of these questions were actually on the economic impact assessment, apart from the usual valuation, capital resources, and capital requirements. Next slide. I mean, we received 40 responses out of the consultation. It is lower than previous consultation, but it also reflects the fact that actually this is the fourth consultation on the ICS. When it comes to respondents, so we receive typically answers from a diverse population, across the world, geographically from Europe, South Africa, North America, Asia, Oceania, and Japan, but also a diverse group of stakeholders. And no surprise, most of the questions which receive most answer are the valuation approach, MAV, the market adjusted valuation approach, internal models, and equity risk. And this is in line with the type of question which ask, because these are the topics for which we also introduce most changes. And with this one, I'll pass it to Lazar, which will take you through the ICS economic impact assessment.
Thank you, Paolo. Hello, everyone. My name is Lazar Bouldi. I'm a senior policy advisor here at the IIS, where I'm working on the ICS. And now I'm going to discuss the economic impact assessment. That is, of course, an important part of our journey toward the finalization of the ICS. So first, I want to share with you the objective of this ICS economic impact assessment. So you may remember that back in 2019, the IIS agreed on ICS version 2.0 for the monitoring period. And by doing this, also committed to producing an economic impact assessment of the ICS before its implementation. The purpose of this assessment is very clear, is to understand any potential significant effects, be they positive or negative, of the implementation of the ICS. What is key here is that this understanding is meant to inform the finalization of the ICS. This assessment is based on the specifications for the ICS released for the 2024 monitoring period exercise. And one important assumption is that it assumes a consistent implementation of the standard in the jurisdiction where the IIG is headquartered. Now, about the objective of this ICS economic impact assessment, I think it's quite important to clarify that the objective of this exercise is not to form a quantitative cost-benefit analysis. The cost of implementation has indeed been considered throughout the design and the field testing phase of the ICS. And some of you may remember some questions that were asked on this aspect via the qualitative questionnaire that came along the annual data collection. Furthermore, and you should understand that there are many methodological challenges in trying to isolate the marginal costs of the ICS implementation compared to other costs. So while we do acknowledge the importance of understanding the cost implications, our focus with this economic impact assessment is really to develop a clear understanding of the potential significant effects of the ICS implementation, rather than just conducting a quantitative cost-benefit analysis. And so moving on to the next slide, I can now share with you the structure of this economic impact assessment that considers issues across different regions and covers also a broad range of potential impacts. So you can see that this assessment focuses on 4 key areas: the insurance products offered by IIGs, the investment policies of IIGs, but also their ability to raise capital or debt, and also what could be the impact on their business models and their profitability. Finally, for the last slide, we can have a look at stakeholder engagement for this assessment. So the methodology of this assessment was really designed to allow for the largest possible range of stakeholders to express their views. This includes not only IIGs and group-wide supervisors, but also consumer groups, rating agencies, and other stakeholder groups, with here the IIS trying to reach a very good geographical diversity. And so this diverse engagement process included stakeholder events, virtual and in person, that some of you may have attended. And those events gave participants the opportunity to provide input on key areas of focus for the ICS economic impact assessment, and that are reflected into the structure of the assessments that I shared with you in the previous slide. Also, as written in this slide, the public consultation last year contained a lot of questions, specifically on the economic impact assessment, as shown by Paolo earlier. We received, therefore, a lot of responses for each question from a lot of different stakeholders. And these responses provide a wide range of opinions on the impact of the ICS, and they were contemplated in the refinement of the ICS for the final rounds of the monitoring period data collection. So that concludes my part of the presentation on the economic impact assessment. And now I can hand over to you, Aurelia.
Thank you very much, Lazare. So going now into the changes that were made between the candidate ICS that was consulted upon in 2023 and the 2024 ICS that goes into the this year data collection, so which is the final year of the monitoring period. So as you can see on this slide, we made some changes, adjustments to a number of in a number of different areas in the ICS. So on valuation, market adjusted valuation, capital resources, then in terms of risk charges, non-life risk, interest rate risk, currency risk, non-default spread risk, credit risk, and also the treatment of non-insurance entities within the group. And as already mentioned by Matt and Paolo, those changes were to a large extent informed by the comments we got in response to the public consultation last year, but also, of course, by the data we collected in 2023, and also the responses to the questionnaire on the economic impact assessment. Note that, well, the 2024 ICS used for the data collection this year, although we expect is, well, pretty close to the final ICS that will be presented for adoption at the end of this year. We cannot formally exclude that there will be some last adjustments depending on what we see from the data coming in this year following the data collection. And now we are going to describe a little bit more in detail the changes that were made, starting with valuation, and for that I will hand over to Martin.
Thanks, Aurelia. Yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Martin Hahn, and I'm with the Secretariat and supporting mainly the work on MAV and internal models, as well as ICP 17. Yeah, as Paolo already pointed out, we got quite a lot of comments on the MAV approach, and taking all those comments into consideration, we made some changes to the MAV approach continuing the path we already started for the 2023 monitoring period. So I'm going only to focus on the main changes. There have been several smaller changes, but I will focus on the bigger ones. And the first one I want to discuss quickly is on the modulation factor. So what we did previously for the computation of the modulation factor, we shifted the yield curve by 1 basis point to see the sensitivity to changes in spreads. Nevertheless, because we use the Smith-Wilson approach, this simplified parallel shift was inconsistent to what we actually do with discounting. So we changed this approach to also use now for the calculation of the modulation factor, use the Smith-Wilson approach, meaning that we shift the yield curve by 1 basis point up to the last observed term, the LOT. And after that, the extrapolation approach is used. And as we have seen in the previous years, this parallel shift, while being a very easy approach to do, it could lead to more conservative results for the modulation factor. So this was adjusted. Also, some comments we got were on management actions, pointing out that the scope of the management actions is rather narrow and only allows adjustments for future discretionary benefits, while other adjustments, for example, goes to premiums, especially for health insurance, are also very common and were not considered. So what we did is we modified the approach for management actions to a more principle-based approach. And this will also allow now for actions such as premium adjustments, but it's important to always point out that whatever happens with management actions, this has to remain within the limits set by the contract boundaries. If we move to the next slide, please. And we also got a lot of comments on the middle bucket. One of these comments were that the middle bucket, because it's based on some criteria, this can lead that if one criteria is not satisfied in a specific year but was satisfied in previous years, that some portfolios qualify and disqualify from the middle bucket in various years. And this again can lead to some balance sheet volatility. So what we did is we added, let's call it continuity criterion, to limit this volatility. And the idea there is that if portfolio or if liabilities pass the criteria for the last 3 years, they can remain in the middle bucket even if not all the criteria are passed for 1 more year. Then it was also pointed out that for the cash flow test we use for the middle bucket, so basically cash flow test tries to identify how long can liabilities cash flows be matched by asset cash flows, and cash flows from callable assets have been excluded previously, but given that the cash flow of a callable bond cannot be changed up to the first call date, we changed this so that cash flows now can be used up to the first call date. So basically, if the cash flow cannot be changed, it can be used for the cash flow test. And also, there were some comments that cash flows from assets in a different currency can only be used for the cash flow test when a hedge is in place. But in some regions, for some currency pairs, apologies, such hedges may not be available or only available at very prohibitive costs. So again, we broadened the scope for the middle bucket there to allow for cash flows from such assets in a different currency, but these cash flows then have to be subject to some safeguards. And there is also proof needed to the supervisor that there are actually no practical or economic hedges available. Okay, thanks. Back to you, Aurelia.
Thank you, Martin. And so we now move on to capital resources. While here, actually, the change made was very limited. We used to have a provision in the 2023 candidate ICS that value of equity and debt owned in entities that are excluded from the scope of the group should be deducted from Tier 1 capital resources. But actually, since, well, as per the building of the ICS, we are starting from the GAAP consolidated group balance sheet and do not provide for the exclusion of entities from that accounting scope of the group. That provision to exclude some debt and equity from Tier 1 capital resources was somehow without an object, and as per the comments we received, apparently created some confusion. So here we just removed that provision to deduct those particular debt and equity linked to entities excluded from the scope of the group in order to remove the confusion, and again because that provision was essentially without object. Then moving to the treatment of non-insurance entities within the group. So in the candidate ICS, there was not necessarily wording alignment between the treatment of non-insurance entities with a sectoral requirement and insurance entities without a sectoral requirement. So we brought further clarity and alignment of wording with that respect. So that's the first point here. Maybe the more important change we made is the second point in that table here. So we provided for calculation of an equity charge based on the equity value of some particular entities within the scope of the group, but that could lead to strange results in the case there is a negative equity value. So that would give rise to a negative equity risk charge as well. And we fixed that essentially by saying that we are working on the absolute value of the equity value to calculate that risk charge, and with a cap to the maximum possible loss. Also we added some wording for the treatment of non-financial consolidated entities. So we had some provisions for non-financial entities that were recognized using an equity method, but not when there was consolidation. And now we are saying that we are using the net asset value for consolidated entities. So we are filling the gap and the missing point that used to be there. So that's for non-insurance. And now I will hand over to Gilbert to lead you through the capital charge, the changes made for the calculation of the capital charges. Gilbert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aurelian. Hi, everyone. My name is Gilbert from the Monetary Authority of Singapore and a vice chair of the CSFWG. I will bring you through the key changes to the ICS capital requirements. On non-life risk, last year, the premium risk factor for non-life risk relating to Hong Kong was set at 30%. We have reviewed the calibration of this segment together with the Hong Kong Insurance Authority, as it may not be reflective of the underlying experience of the segment. So based on the work done, the premium risk factor has been updated from 30% to 10%. Next slide on interest rate risk. For the interest rate risk module, we are making two changes. First, the interest rate risk charge in 2023 required the determination of the impact from 5 scenarios for each currency before being aggregated. We received feedback from the ICS consultation that this can be complex. So the number of scenarios have been reduced from 5 to 3 by dropping the 2 twist stresses. Second, the LTFR was stressed by plus or minus 10% last year. This stress can be higher than the maximum allowable annual change in LTFR of 15 basis points. So for this final year of ICS, the shock will be kept at the same 15 basis point cap for the LTFR. Next, we go to currency risk. The currency risk stress factors were graded in increments of 5 percentage points, starting at 5%. Based on our internal review, we are aware that for certain currencies, the 5% may be too large for certain currencies. Hence, we have introduced a lower bucket with a stress factor of 2%. Based on our analysis, the 4 currency pairs that you are seeing on this slide will fall into this lower bucket. Next slide, we go into non-default spread risk. In the design of the candidate ICS last year, the NDSR bidirectional relative stress of 75% was introduced in the candidate ICS and consulted upon. Based on comments received, we understand that a proportional uncapped stress can lead to large shocks in high spread environments. For this final year of the monitoring period, for the up stress, we have introduced a movement cap of 150 basis points and a movement floor of 40 basis points. And I think on the last section on capital requirements, this would be on credit risk. In the design of the candidate ICS last year, cash was not included as a potential collateral. So for this year, we have added cash to the list of eligible assets, which includes collateral. On the next section relating to the ICS calibration document, I will pass over to Paolo. Paolo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gilbert. And let's move to the next slide. Just to give you a reminder that while we're doing a calibration document, the IIS committed to prepare and release a calibration document for the ICS, including the risk charges and disaggregation ahead of the implementation in 2025. What is a calibration document? We aim with the calibration document to provide information, background information about the analysis which the IIS carried out to come out with the ICS risk charges, including their aggregation, as set out in the level 1 and level 2 text. Just to bear in mind that the calibration document is intended to be factual and transparent and builds on the work which we have done during development and monitoring on the ICS. And we're not disclosing the information which refers to firm-specific information, which is subject to confidentiality restrictions. Next slide. As I say, the calibration document will provide explanation on how we came out with the determination of risk factors and how we came out with the variance covariance matrix, which determines the aggregation of the different risk charges. And we'll make information available on the different risk module for insurance risk, market risk, credit risk, operational risk, as well the correlation matrices we use for this process. Bear in mind that because non-insurance risk charges relies on sectoral requirements, for which in some cases the calibration has not been performed by the IIS, we're not covering the risk charges for non-insurance risk. For example, we rely on Basel for banking requirements and so on. Also, we're not covering the treatment of tax in this document, as this item does not constitute a risk charge that relies on calibration process. And I'll now back to Martin which will gonna take you through ICP 14 and 17.
Thanks, Paulo. Yeah, so for ICP 14 and 17, belong to the longer ICPs, especially ICP 17, which is, I think, by far the longest. We, as you can see, asked a lot of questions, so 116 and 242 for ICP 14 and 17, respectively. And we also got quite a lot of comments, so 26 for 14 and 95 for ICP 17. In general, there was broad support for the amendments made to ICPs 14 and 17. And I may now move to the most outstanding feedback we received from stakeholders. So for ICP 14, there was the request for clarification on whether certain concepts common to ICP 14 and IFRS 17 are consistent. For example, fulfillment value and contract boundaries. Then there was request for further clarifications on MOCHI, so margin over current estimate. And there were quite a number of editorial suggestions to improve consistency and readability, which is a similar theme for ICP 17. So we got quite a lot of editorial suggestions to make the paper or the ICP easier to read and more consistent. And there was also the request to add on to ICP 17 references to climate risk and
Looks like we lost Martin, but I think he was probably done with his update, mentioning references to climate risk and cyber risk. So probably I can just move on with the next section and what is awaiting us, next steps in 2024. So as already mentioned, we have a data collection which is currently underway with our volunteer groups, and we expect to receive data from them this year by the end of July, so in 1 month's time. And the data we'll get from there and the results following analysis will inform the final version of the ICS. As I said, there is still some room, if needed, for some last adjustments, depending on what we see from the data and whether there are any unintended consequences of the changes we made between 2023 and 2024. And so that will feed into the ICS that will be then presented for adoption in December this year in Cape Town. And then once the, or assuming the ICS is adopted as planned, the IIS is then planning to release not only the ICS documents themselves, so the level 1 and level 2 document. We have kept that same structure as we had for the previous version of the ICS. We'll also publish a resolution of the comments received from the public consultation last year, as well as the report on the ICS economic impact assessment. And in addition, so Paulo spoke about that a little bit earlier, we're also planning to release the ICS calibration document shortly after the publication of the ICS. And in parallel with those ICS-related publications, So we are planning to adopt changes to the ICP 14 and 17, also following the public consultation, so what Martin just spoke about, and also release a report on the aggregation method comparability assessment. So that's more or less it for between now and the end of this year regarding ICS. And then there is also the question what is going to happen beyond the end of this year. And here we enter the realm of ICS implementation. And I will hand over to Romain to speak about that. Romain, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aurélien. I hope everyone can hear me well. My name is Romain Passereau. I am the Deputy Secretary General of the IIS. And as Matt has indicated in the beginning, so of course, with the ICS adoption that approaching, we are very much working now on looking ahead and preparing for the implementation of the ICS. And we are very excited that today we can share decisions that we made in our last week meetings, where the implementation of the ICS was an important area of our work last week. So maybe to provide a bit of context, just a quick reminder, what is the role of the IIS as a standard setter, as the global standard setter for insurance supervision. So as you can see in the slide, so the IIS is developing a standard for insurance supervision. We do not have the legal authority to mandate the implementation of these standards into national legislations. However, our membership is committed to implementing IIS standards and supervisory material, while also, of course, adapting it to their specific market circumstances. So as for any other IIS standard, the ICS will constitute a minimum standard, which IIS members will implement or propose to implement, taking into account market specificities in their jurisdiction. So now looking at the implementation assessment high-level timeline. So at its June meeting, the IIS Executive Committee has set a high-level timeline for its plan to assess the comprehensive and consistent implementation of the ICS across jurisdictions. This timeline recognizes that it will take some time for jurisdiction to finalize any necessary regulatory and supervisory changes to align with the ICS, taking into account jurisdictional circumstances and for the IIS at the time that is needed to prepare for implementation assessment. So the IIS Executive Committee has agreed that the ICS implementation assessment will follow a two-step approach, which will be mirroring the successful model that we have been using for the implementation assessment of the holistic framework supervisory material, the IAS standards for macroprudential supervision that were adopted in 2019. What does it mean in concrete terms? So in 2026, the IIS will coordinate a baseline self-assessment by IIS members of their progress in implementing the ICS, which will serve as a baseline for future implementation progress monitoring. The IIS will then aim to start in-depth targeted jurisdictional assessments in 2027. Next slide, please. So in preparation for this assessment, the IIS will begin developing a detailed ICS implementation assessment methodology in 2025. This methodology will leverage the IIS general principles and methodologies for assessing its standards, but also will take into account the quantitative nature of the ICS. Recognizing that the assessment should not be a line-by-line exercise, and of course, everyone is aware of the number of lines we have in the draft level 1 and level 2 ICS text, the methodology will specify an appropriate level of granularity and articulate the quantitative and qualitative analysis to be used in the assessment. The IIS will also undertake further work this year to define the need for and the scope of any future ICS-related data collection from insurance groups and group-wide supervisor that may be necessary to facilitate the consistent implementation of the ICS, which is in nature different from what we have been doing during the monitoring period. And so while the scope of this such potential data collection has not yet been defined, as I said, this is going to be different from what we have done during the monitoring period, and of course more targeted than the data collection those who have been contributed to are familiar with. And with that, just a word with regard to the AM implementation assessment. So in parallel with the finalization of the ICS, as you're aware, the United States is developing an aggregation method for group capital adequacy, which, if deemed comparable, would be considered an outcome equivalent approach for implementation of the ICS. So we are now doing the comparability assessment. Issues related to the implementation assessment of the AM will be considered by the IAS once there is greater clarity on the outcome of the AM comparability assessment and on the overall ICS implementation assessment methodology. Just a word also to note that we are also releasing today the 2024 AM data collection package. And with that, back to you, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Roman. And now we open the floor for Q&As. So in order to do so, correct me if I'm wrong, Aurélien, but people can raise their hands or send a note in the chat, and your line will be open.
Yeah, that's correct, Paolo.
Do we have any questions? Don't be shy. I think we got Gaspar. Can we open the line of Gaspar Murat?
You are unmuted, Gaspar.
Gaspar, you can speak. I think your line has been open. In the meantime, until Gaspar can Gaspar can speak, but I saw there is let's try to go through the chat. I saw that the first question was, there was a question about internal models. If there have been changes into the technical specification of internal models. No, there's no be changes to an internal model. If there have been more clarification in light of, or there will be clarification which comes through the consultation, but it doesn't impact the overall results. Correct, Martin?
Sorry, I have some technical issues, so I've moved to my phone. Yes, correct, Paolo.
Yeah. I think we got a question also from Charles from SFR. Yeah, and the question is more about data requests. Well, data requests for volunteers during the monitoring period. And I think to say in terms of that, I mean, certainly, this year marks the end of the monitoring period. That's an important point. So effectively, if there were to be the need for further data from volunteers, there certainly will be of a limited scope and to support the implementation assessment, nothing more than that. But Roman, you may have something to add to this one.
Yeah, so if I understand well, the question is during the assessment, whether there will be a request to produce ICS calculation. So I guess maybe it's a produce ICS calculation compared to the implementation of the ICS. So, well, the question is it possible to imagine? So I don't want to refrain anyone imagination. So of course, very happy for produce imagination. So, but this is typically this kind of question that we would like to review, assess as part of developing the methodology. And the purpose of the methodology will be to clearly set out and articulate which kind of quantitative analysis we may want to perform in these two different steps. The baseline is going to be a lighter exercise. It's more of a self-assessment by jurisdiction, but the targeted jurisdictional assessment, there might be questions around the tests that we may want to do. But clarity on that will be provided in due time when we'll be sharing the methodology.
We are going to work through figuring out what data we will request next year. That's a project for the remainder of the year. As has already been indicated, you can expect the data to be necessarily less extensive next year. We're not sure quite how much less extensive. Those are issues we're discussing at the IIS. We don't have any decisions on the exact scope of future data collections at this point.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. I think we got a question about the implementation from Vladimir, implementation on the ICS into national regime. And I think if you go back to one of the first slides that Romain presented on implementation, is actually the IIS cannot mandate the local implementation. So go back to the previous one. Yeah, so the IIS doesn't have the legal authority to mandate implementation of standard international legislation. So effectively, it would be for the Korean authority to decide when to implement, when and what to implement of the ICS or the ICS going forward. And I think that the plans will be aligned with our implementation. With this acceptation of the ICS in the US, I think in Kuala Lumpur, starting from Kuala Lumpur and Abu Dhabi, I mean, the aggregation method developed by the IIS agreed that the aggregation method developed by the US authority will be assessed whether produce comparable outcomes to the ICS, and if that's the case, it can be used as any implementation of the ICS in the US. And I think there is a follow-up question as well related to that. And whether equivalence approach assessment will be conducted for other jurisdictional capital standard like the AM. If you go back to another slide on implementation, I think is the last one on the aggregation method, that provides an answer to that as well. Issues related to the implementation assessment of the AM will be considered by the IIS when there is greater clarity on the outcome, the comparability assessment, and the overall ICS implementation assessment methodology. I think there were more questions on what did I miss? I think there was a question from Ian about the scope of transitional measure that will be part of the ICS and implementation thereof. I think we consulted on part of transitional measure as part of the 2023 consultation. Oriane, can you clarify if there is any more additional transitional measure foreseen now?
No, there are no additional transition measures on top of those that were already included in the 2023. So the candidate ICS. So those are transitional measures on some capital instruments, recognition of capital instruments.
You have to bear in mind, Ian, as well, that when it comes to some of the transitional measures, some of the transitional measures may need to be set out at local level, because that depends on how distant your regime is compared to the ICS. So the IIS is not in a position to set out these more specific transitionals. I think a question for you, Aurelian, about where the slides will be posted, where today's slides will be posted.
Oh, actually, Lazar has responded already and provided the link in the chat box.
Oh, sorry. Good. A question for Roman from George about the implementation assessment of ConFrame and the ICS. Roman?
Yes, I'm sorry. I have an issue with my computer, so I cannot see the questions.
Okay. I'll read the question. As a component part of ConFrame, will the implementation assessment of the ICS also look more broadly at members' implementation of all elements of ConFrame, or otherwise take account of elements that impact the effectiveness of quantitative measures?
So that's a good question. So ICS is clearly a component of ConFrame. So will we be relying on the general principles and methodology for the assessment of ComFrame? We also recognize that it's quite a component in itself. So we will develop a specific methodology for the assessment of the ICS. And when the assessor will review the ICS implementation, they will look at this methodology to deliver their result in terms of the assessment. As you can see, the way we are assessing our standards, we are assessing standard by standard. So you may see that in the result of the targeted jurisdictional assessment. So the IS is going to continue to assess other standard of ComFrame and assess the ICS. And for the assessment of the ICS, it will consider the elements set out in the methodology for the result of this assessment.
Beyond that, I can just say the IS will definitely be looking at the components of ComFrame. We're also starting the ComFrame implementation assessment. I'm not sure how much to read in that question if you're talking about whether or not some of that could be looked at together with the ICS or even potentially offset within it. We've started to discuss this idea of offsetting within the IS now. There's some support for at least looking at some things at a higher level. I'm not sure if it would carry that far to where we'd be offsetting qualitative components elsewhere in ComFrame.
Yeah.
It's a quantitative component within the ICS. Our initial discussions, members were largely supportive of trying to do, given this is the quantitative component of ComFrame, trying to do what we can quantitatively, recognizing the data limitations. And we're not sure how much we can do, but that's a decision to be made at a future date. We'll have more to say over the remainder of the year and into next year, as we hope to get the plan is to get the implementation assessment methodology out by the end of next year.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, this is one of the issues which we like the development of implementation assessment methodology we need to look into. Another question for you, Roman, is about GME and about is from Dupois. Could you confirm that the adoption of the ICS will have no impact on the GME data collection exercise?
So the adoption of the ICS in itself has no consequence on the GME, but of course, as our members are moving to the implementation of the ICS, we can expect that the data on solvency will probably going to be from an ICS implementation. So, but yes, this is a separate project, but of course, again, the data that we are collecting through the GME are likely to be impacted by the implementation of the ICS, as some of the data that we have collected through the GME have been impacted by accounting standard changes or etc.
Thanks. I think there is a question I don't understand about from Yogendra about the ICS being future taxonomy based like the by EIOPA. So I don't know if you want Yogendra, if you want to clarify that. I have another question from Tanzin about approved internal model. So can local jurisdiction allow for the approved internal model for capital requirements in place at the ICS basis? I think this is slightly. I'll rephrase this question because if adopted in December 2024, the ICS will contain two methods for the calculation of capital requirement. Will be one based on the standard method and the other one based on the capital on internal models. So there will be a part of the ICS not different from the ICS. Now, with capacity to local implementation, that applies to everything else. It will be good. It's again back to what Roman said at the beginning, that effectively that jurisdiction will need to look at the requirements of the ICS and decide what to implement and how to implement that. And this will be the local implementation of the ICS will be part of the assessment by the IIS. Okay, I think we got the question then. Whether there will be a public consultation conducted on the implementation assessment methodology. Roman, this is for you.
So there won't be a public consultation. We do public consultation on specific cases, like before the adoption of IAS standards. But of course, there will be opportunities for stakeholders to engage with us and provide feedback and input to the development of the methodology. So this is going to be, as we have done throughout the journey to the ICS adoption, a very open process, and we certainly will want to get input from you in this as well.
Thanks, Roman. Then I think there is a clarification from Rich Poniatowski about AM, said the US has already completed, adopted the NAC, and this is just a clarification of your slide. Not sure I understand the question. Matt, you may be more better placed for this one.
I think this was just I think he's just commenting on the slide.
Okay.
There is, like, you're welcome to ask, otherwise we'll take it as a comment.
And another question from Ian, that's whether as the ICS will constitute a minimum standard, does mean that any authority which has a group capital regime which results in a more onerous capital position will meet the ICS implementation. And the answer to this question here is that we'll still have to discuss the implementation the implementation assessment methodology. You would have seen that from the previous slides, if you go back to one or two slides, please. No, that's the other one. If you look at the second bullet point, there is pretty, what we can say at the moment that we recognize that the assessment should not be a line-by-line exercise, but the methodology which we still have to develop will specify the appropriate level of granularity and articulate the quantitative and qualitative analysis to be used in the assessment. So this is the answer that we can give you at the moment, and bear with us because we still have to start the work on the implementation assessment methodology. The answer is not that straightforward. Another question on internal models from Tamzin again, about if a regime has a more complex internal model approval regime that results in lower capital than the ICS, does it make the complex regime redundant? I think that you can't provide an answer to this question, I think, in isolation. First, you need to look at, what are the, that will be part of the assessment of the regime. And I think again you already answered, Roman, about if there will be a consultation for the implementation methodology, but you already provided an answer to that. And a question about along the lines of AM comparability, whether jurisdiction-specific group capital standard will also be considered for comparability purpose. Roman, back to you.
Well, so we are not providing an update on the comparability assessment today. We are discussing the ICS implementation. So just want to flag that the comparability assessment is going on track, and we'll probably provide some updates at the global seminar. So I think we have to make a clear distinction here. We are doing an AM comparability assessment for the aggregation method that is developed in the US. Though that's the only AM or regime that we are looking at as part of the comparability assessment. For other jurisdictions, we are going to work on the ICS assessment methodology.
And a question from Angus about whether the ICS technical specification form part of the official ICS. Just bear in mind, Angus, that the level 1 and level 2 are already part of the ICS technical specification. We call the technical specification level 3 because on top of the level 1 and the articulation of the level 1, the level 2 text, it also includes some example, like in the boxes, which are quite helpful to firms. So while in December you will find the IIS will adopt the level 1 and the level 2 text, after that, the IIS will aim to provide support and guidance both to firms and jurisdiction for the implementation, and this will include guidance, additional guidance, application papers on the ICS, which will articulate and include examples which were part of the technical specification, and also some of the examples which may arise during the ICS implementation process. Again, I think, Angus, your question is always about the technical specifications. Yet, if the technical specification will be considered part of the technical specification will be part of the implementation assessment, bear in mind that the level we will assess we will assess jurisdiction based on the level 1, the level 2 text. The additional example are not requirements, are just clarification and elaboration about the level 1 and the level 2 text. And I think that's, if I'm not sure, I don't think I have missed any question. If you have any more question, please let us know. What is the deadline for the IIS members to implement the ICS? I think we have a starting date. We are very inclusive. We don't want to close the door to anybody who would like to implement the ICS in the future. Anything more?
Yeah. On the starting date, I can just say I think that's to some extent tied up with when we start the implementation assessments. Yeah. We'll start the baseline assessment as the plan. We'll develop the assessment methodology next year, do the baseline afterwards. If a jurisdiction hasn't implemented, I would expect that would be their response, and their own baseline self-assessment is that we haven't implemented yet, and then we will start the more in-depth assessments on that in 2027 targeted. We will certainly prioritize those that are furthest along in the implementation in the first wave. I think if a jurisdiction had not yet implemented, there would not be much for us to assess at that point.
Yeah, the implementation period starts the day after we adopt that, but then effectively when the IIS will start the assessment, as Matt was saying, is starting with the self-assessment 2026, then the full assessment is aiming to start in 2027. And question about, this is one for Roman, is about how the IIS assessment fits with the IMF FSAP assessment.
Yeah, so this is generally a question that should be asked to the IMF, but of course we are working very much with them. From our past experience is that the IMF is following closely the indication from the IIS in terms of the starting date of including any IIS material in the FSAP process, but they're also working very closely with us in terms of using our own approach for the assessment. So we are working with them on that, but I cannot answer for them. But of course, I mean, we should expect a perfect coordination and alignment to ensure that in terms of the starting date of considering the ICS within the FSAP and the starting date of the ICS assessment, but as well as the methodology that will be used for the assessment, there will be a good alignment. Of course, subject to their difference in terms of overall methodology, objectives, results, and perspective that the IMF has, which can be different from the IIS.
Thanks, Roman. And I got another question from you, and this is again from Dutrois, and is, are several jurisdictions interested in the aggregation method?
So there has been several jurisdictions interested in the aggregation method. They have been participating in the AM data collection package, but for the purpose of the comparability assessment, there's only one jurisdiction, the US, that is part of the comparability assessment.
Thanks. And again, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Yes, one from Ralph. How often will the calibration of the ICS be reviewed and updated? For jurisdictions that are replacing their capital requirements with the ICS, they will need the ICS reflection of the local risk being kept up to date. And I think, yeah, probably. Yeah, please.
So we've had initial discussions at the committee levels on what's next with the ICS. Our priority over the coming years is going to be the assessment methodology and providing support to members in implementing the ICS through questions and answers and other items as needed. Recalibration, especially if we see any parameters that would need recalibration, is on the list, but it's not a high priority at this stage. So it's something we'll come back to. There's no set timeline currently. But please, especially after you see the calibration document, if you see anything that you think any feedback on that, we're open to it. We can consider it, but we have no set plans to recalibrate the ICS. As you will see in the calibration document, calibrating the first time was not an easy work. We had 11 years of data collection at this point, extensive work calibrating it. So there's not a desire to immediately launch into a recalibration.
Thank you, Matt. Next, can see any more queries? Final opportunity for queries. No queries? Oh, yes. Local implementation means that also application to solo firms, right? And this is the question. I mean, but just bear in mind that ICS is a group consolidated standard. So it is not a solo standard. It's a group consolidated standard. So it applies only to international active insurance groups and is a group consolidated standard. Any more questions before I pass it back to Matt for conclusions?
Just a heads up on that last one. I think ICP 14 and 17, while the ICS is the COM frame portion, ICP 14 and 17, I think would have broader application.
Yes. Matt, I don't see any more questions. Back to you for conclusions.
So thank you all again for joining today and for your engagement both today and over the years, all the data submissions, all the comments, we very much appreciate it. And I hope we're able to provide some insights to you as far as how we've incorporated that into both the technical specifications for this year, which I do think provide a good indication of the ICS that the IAS plans to adopt later this year, as well as our initial thinking on ICS implementation. Look forward to more dialogue to come, particularly over the remainder of the year, and as we make progress on further defining what implementation will look like in the next phase. So thank you all for joining, appreciate it, and have a nice day.
Bye-bye.